Jeff. I'm going to introduce, we have a really great panel for you today with a lot of deep expertise in financing particularly. So we're going to talk about how we can come up with solutions to this problem we've been discussing all morning. I'll start with Donald Cohen on the end. He is the director of In the Public Interest. They're a group that researches public-private partnerships, or P3s. And their focus really is on protecting the public and getting information out to taxpayers and policymakers.
That's great.
Next is Sharon Hendricks. She is board vice chair at the California State Teachers Retirement System. And she's also a professor and union leader with the Los Angeles Community College District.
Good job.
Next we have Aaron Klein. He is formerly with the Treasury, where he helped craft the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act. And he works with the Bipartisan Policy Institute and on financial regulatory reform. And last we have Joe Mysak. He's with Bloomberg. He's an expert on municipal bonds. He is the author of the Encyclopedia of Municipal Bonds, and he's an editor there at Bloomberg. So I want to start off with Donald. Your group has uncovered some, potential concerns with P3 infrastructure, although it's been sort of touted as a panacea at times. So I want to give you a chance to sort of discuss that. What are your concerns, along with what are some of the potential upsides, potentially?
Sure. This is on, I take it. So let me just clarify. I am not an expert in finance. I am have far more expertise in politics, which I think is the theme of the day, is at what is at the core of our problems in terms of building infrastructure. The first thing is, before we get to the P3, because I have been, and many of us have been in lots of presentations and panels and discussions about P3s, the starting question is what we've heard this morning, is the problem is not how do we do more P3s, the problem is how we get to public finance. Infrastructure is a public good, whether we got here that way, whether we turn on the water that way, so we have certain responsibilities no matter how we pay for it. So, two facts to remember. Much of public infrastructure, is already privately financed, right? There's really, in the end, only one source of money. There's taxpayer money, there's investor money when we purchase municipal bonds. So there's already a lot of private capital in public finance. The second important fact to remember is that no matter how we finance it, the same people pay for the service through either user fee. We, taxpayers, citizens, residents, pay through users fees, taxes, general fund, however it is. So it's really important to sort of start that conversation that way. So when you look at P3s, then the only question is how we pay for it, to build it, to maintain it, to operate it. First off, public finance is a lot cheaper and it's a lot more flexible. I think we'll hear more about that later on. It's, I could build a house on 3% right now. Why should we not be building infrastructure on those kind of with those kind of capital terms? So, but there are times, I think we'd all agree, for political reasons, we can't either raise the gas tax, or we can't pass a bond measure at a state or city, or we can't, or people oppose tolls. There are political reasons, or there are debt limit problems where we can't get to use that cheaper public capital. So if that's the case, is what are we going to get if we bring in private finance, and what are we going to lose when we bring in private finance? What we get is maybe quicker. What usually we get is something that we can do it faster. That's the one thing. I think there are other areas where that are debatable, and we should do that. What we lose is, one thing to remember is private contracts. These agreements are rigid documents for 30 or 40 or 50 or 70 or 99 years, although I don't think we're doing any of those deals anymore. And that we are basically handing over some level of control of a public good to that private contract and to the interests of the investors. The worst case scenario are the non-compete clauses that many of you heard about. Those are going away, but compensation clauses are not going to go away, for good reason from the investor side, but they're constricting from our side, and we can talk more about that if we want to get into. The other important thing to remember, for every individual deal, not the taxes that the Congressman was talking about, there are political decisions. Governor Christie didn't build that tunnel between New York and New Jersey. It was an entirely political decision that will hurt the economy of New York, of New Jersey. It was publicly financed. You wouldn't even do it with private finance. It's a political decision. So just, I guess my final point in terms of the problem is that because I've been in lots of discussions around P3s where we figure out what are the obstacles. And the obstacles tend to be constituencies, right? And so constituencies for jobs, constituencies for the environment, constituencies that just don't want something built in their backyard. And so if we, again, at the local level, if we can try to build the coalition, address those issues, and build the coalition at the local level that the Congressman talked about at the national level, we actually can get things done. If we overtly deal with jobs and job pathways, if we overtly deal with sustainability issues, that would build the coalition for more infrastructure as well, and investment infrastructure, whether privately or publicly financed. I have one last thing I'll say in terms of, and we can do this without privatizing. We can do a P3 without privatization. We could finance it, but we could do, that would be DBF for those that are in that realm, thinking about it in that way. So we may have to pay more money, we pay a little bit more money, but let's not lock ourselves into a 75 years where we lose policy control over our infrastructure system.
Thanks. We'll move on to Sharon. She comes from a different perspective. Her organization is an early investor in P3 infrastructure in the United States. Some countries like Canada and Australia have a long history of investment, pension investment in infrastructure through these P3 partnerships. The California State Teachers Retirement System is the second largest pension system in the country, and they've gotten involved with investing in infrastructure directly, and she's going to talk a little bit about what their experience has been and what kinds of infrastructure projects they're interested in.
Yeah. Hi, Sharon Hendricks from California State Teachers Retirement System. I love the rain here. We need rain in California, if you haven't heard. So it's great to see rain. I'll bring some back with me to Los Angeles. I live in Los Angeles. I wear a couple of hats. These days, my first love is being in the classroom. I work in the community college of Los Angeles in the heart of Hollywood with a lot of low-income immigrant students. Education, I think, is the greatest job in the world. So that's been my first love. But throughout the years, I kind of got mentored into this role of being elected onto the California State Teachers Retirement Board. And I found that being a trustee of a fund CalSTRS size, besides being intimidating, is an incredible opportunity for us to think about workers' capital. I'm part of the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, which is part of the AFL-CIO, for those of you who follow in the labor circles. And I'm really proud of the work that Randy Weingarten at AFT and the AFL-CIO, Trumpka, what that organization has done in terms of trying to put some capital, workers' capital, towards infrastructure. It's been pretty exciting. I was at the Clinton Global Initiative last year where I believe it was in 2011. Mike, you can correct me if that's 2011. There was an announcement from the AFL-CIO saying, we want to make a $10 billion commitment for workers' capital into infrastructure. We have $2 trillion of workers' capital. If you count all the money around the U.S. in terms of our pension funds, $2 trillion is a lot of money. And so we have that kind of capital, and so the AFL-CIO made a commitment of $10 billion. And actually this last year, it was 2014, we were able to say we actually achieved that and have exceeded that. I think we're at $14 billion now in 2015. So it's really exciting to see organizations like the AFL-CIO and being part of the AFT kind of making that kind of commitment to real dollars. I think this conversation sometimes becomes really academic, and it is political. I mean, you can't get away from that. But I know for me as an active worker and as a person who's an active person contributing to my own pension fund in California, I care a lot about how the money's invested. I want to help create jobs. I want to help the U.S. economy. And so I'm kind of a pragmatist. I just want to make money for the fund as a fiduciary of a large fund, but I also want to do that thoughtfully. And so some of the things we're doing, as was mentioned, we have made an investment in a PPP project, the Long Beach Courthouse in California. Our board has had different, I really want to get your thoughts, hopefully, in the panel, because there's some controversy over PPP projects, and I think our fund is pretty conservative, so I think we have some questions. That's been a successful project, but I think there are definitely some challenges in that space. I think for me, I chaired our investment committee, and again, our fund is $190 billion. So it's a lot of capital. We hope to get to about 6% of our asset allocation in infrastructure. We've hired a couple of new staff in our infrastructure space. I think we have 5 staff now, which for some institutional investors seems like a lot. For us, we have 110 investment staff, and so 5 feels paltry. And I think the expertise issue is a real challenge in the infrastructure space. Getting staff that know what they're doing and that are spending time with the Australians and the Dutch and other folks who are really, real leaders and models for us to follow. So one of the things I guess I wanted to tell you, some of the things we're thinking about. We started in 2008 as a fund looking at infrastructure. We have a $4 billion commitment. We've allocated about $1.5 billion in the space. One of our challenges is finding deals, right? Finding places to invest our capital. And so I'm hoping to get some answers from all of you today about how to solve that challenge. But one of the things that I'm really excited about that there's a press release coming out soon, but I guess I can't tell you who we're doing it with. But one of the things I know I'm excited about as a fiduciary is I'm always thinking about how to maximize our returns, because in California, as many pension funds have, we have a challenge with unfunded liability. So we want to maximize, as everyone does, maximize returns, mitigate risk, and reduce fees. And so one of the things we're looking at is, instead of doing the traditional, hiring a manager to do infrastructure for us, we want to do more direct investing as an institutional investor. So we literally just kind of inked a deal with another large pension fund to do that. So the two of us are coming together. We're hiring our own managers, so we have control over fees. We have control over all these policies and the language in those contracts that are so important to have, so that we still have some control. So I'm really excited about that, honestly, to cut out the middleman, because we all know the middleman costs a lot. So I'm really excited about some of the work that we're doing, our staff, thinking about how to be a little bit more flexible and lean. Infrastructure fits our profile, our investment profile. It's kind of, we call it like long-term, boring, no offense, patient capital. We like that at CalSTRS. We like something that is safe, that's secure, but also it's long-term. We're a long-term investor. We've been around, I think, 102 years now. And as long as there's teachers in California, we hope to be around. And so infrastructure fits really well, I think, with our kind of, as we look at our asset allocation, it's a real, a good balance for us. So we're really excited about the space. We're thinking about new things, and I'm really looking forward to hearing other thoughts from you all about some ideas. I certainly hope, that we can continue to grow in our putting some more money in this space. So.
Thank you.
Sure.
Aaron, I'm sorry, I misnamed your organization. He's with the Bi-Policy Partisan Center. So you have a lot of experience in policy here on the Hill, and have worked with the federal government on some reform issues. What's sort of your perspective about the opportunities with this private financing and other creative solutions to this infrastructure funding issue we're really struggling with?
Yeah, thank you, Angie, and thank you, Mark and Jeff and the Century Foundation. It's a pleasure to be here. I think the comments up to now have been fantastic in setting the stage. And let me just add one more point for this panel. We often misuse or use interchangeably the terms funding and financing. They mean radically different things. Think about infrastructure, not just about all of us as people in the room and taxpayers as pay, but think about infrastructure as things that span multiple generations, 50 years, 100 years. But when you build it, when you pay for it, you have to pay for the construction at the time it occurs. You can do this one of two ways. You can fully fund an investment, that is, one group of people writes the check today for something that's going to last for a long time. Future generations essentially get that new infrastructure bequeathed, free and clear. They have to pay for the maintenance, but not the construction. Society builds its capital stock. I'm going to rely a little on my economist jargon, but we increase the level of capital, physical capital, and each generation, kind of, this is a core element of the broader American dream, each generation is a little bit better than the last. That's funding. Financing is when you say, you know what, everybody, in order to take this money today, we're gonna get a revenue source or a stream of repayments over time, possibly even linking the full life of the asset. And we're gonna borrow against that, and that can be through user fees of tolls, it can be through municipal bonds of future taxpayer revenues. And every generation and user is gonna pay their fair, quote unquote, fair share. But nobody's getting anything free and clear. You get the road and you get the toll, you get the road and you get the bond payment. And that's how you finance a project. Most projects have a mixture of both. States and local governments historically mostly finance, often through municipal debt in America, globally often very project focused, specific project finance, much more common globally. The US has a long, robust municipal debt market. I can get into that, but I think Joe will. The federal government has historically funded. Through the gas tax, as Congressman Blumenauer described, through aviation taxes, we collect revenue immediately, we write the check. The federal government really does no project finance because we have one giant treasury debt market, but most of the stuff isn't deficit spent, it's actually trust fund spent, and that's funded. And those are, if I can leave you with one thought, that's one very different, that's a radically different thought. Because of the lack of political will that we've described, because potentially there's some other advantages, which I'll go into in a second, the federal government is starting to move more from a funding model to a financing model. We have a very small financing program called TIFIA in the federal government. I see many people nodding their heads. In the last transportation bill, surface transportation bill, total investment was flat. TIFIA went up by over 800%. So that gives you an idea of what's growing, which is this financing. Money's lent, has to get paid back, future users, versus funding. Gas tax flat since 1993. The second point I'll raise about private investment is the federal government isn't going to invest enough, and the states and locals aren't investing enough. You can either let your capital stock deteriorate, which we have seen as the world economic rankings of our infrastructure go like this, and that has major global competitiveness problems. China's rankings are going like this. It has serious inequality issues because as you have to do some amount of maintenance, we can guess whether the roads rich people drive are more paved or the roads poor people drive. We can gather whether bus service is cut back more than train service, etc. As inequality, and as jobs ramifications, right? Or you can bring in other sources of investors who have traditionally been locked out of this funded or municipal debt finance, which includes pension funds and other private investors. Possibly, in project finance, we've seen throughout the globe, people reallocate resources around existing or new infrastructure to use it more efficiently. I'll close with this efficiency point. I helped write SAFE-T, which I hope the congressman counted as the last full reauthorization when he made that kind of subtle dig on map 21. No dig on that from my end, but we did a pretty full bill. I was in charge of the transit Title III, with many colleagues. And we found in there a prohibition, a federal law banning the use of intercity bus in facilities that serve transit. This dates back to some sort of competition period between Greyhound and trains and trolleys in the 50s. What has this meant in reality? It's meant that every time you have a train station, the bus system is located in a different building, always across the tracks, always in the worst side of the tracks. Port Authority, K Street Station, it has equality, it has crime, and it's silly. Because everybody who's taking Greyhound is probably getting there through a bus or a train to the Greyhound. Nobody drives to Greyhound and parks and takes the bus. Right? Made in the 50s. So we repealed the law. And guess what? Private bus people don't want to be in these expensive, rundown, unsafe environments across the street. They want to be in the big train station, whether it's Union Station here in Washington, the Silver Spring Transit Center was supposed to open in my hometown, was supposed to move them from literally, they were 5 blocks away, just in Little Silver Spring, Maryland, in a crime area next to the police station. And we repealed that. Why? Because that was an inefficiency built into the system. There are a lot of inefficiencies at the federal, state, and local level. Hopefully, potentially, private capital can bring in to unlock, to create more value throughout the entire project, and that can help solve some of our political problem about getting the courage to get the revenue to either fund or finance the projects.
Thanks. So Joe is more of an expert on public finance, and a lot of his writing has focused lately on, there's been a lot of concern about whether localities and states with this funding crisis are getting a little bit over leveraged, and he's been critical of that point of view. I wanted to ask you, how much money do you think potentially is out there in municipal bonds, and how much additional borrowing capacity do you think there is, and what are the benefits of tapping into that a little bit more, and what are maybe some of the drawbacks?
Well, you know, I'm kind of the anti-hysteric in the room, which means everybody, let's start yelling. You know, the states and localities spend between $100 billion and $200 billion a year on infrastructure. They borrow in the municipal bond market. In the last couple of years, we've had, I'd say last decade, it's at least $300 billion in borrowing every year, sometimes over $400 billion. Part of that, of course, is in refinancing older, higher coupon, more expensive debt, fine. But most of the debt that states and municipalities incur is used for infrastructure, and infrastructure being defined as, you know, replacing a stop sign or traffic lights or sidewalks or schools, sewers. It's all, you know, it's a big, big, robust group of things that states and municipalities are financing, you know, all the time. It's not as though, I guess in the last, you know, since the financial crisis, you've had a little bit of austerity as places have stepped back and said, well, it's not a good idea for us to borrow right now. Let's wait. Let's delay this financing. And of course, it's been, as you mentioned before, the interest rates have been, you know, at generational lows. So it's been a very good time for them to refinance their outstanding debt. But even with that, you've seen this, you know, $100 billion a year plus financing going on. Now, you know, down the line, again, anti-hysteric. You know, once you pass maybe the top 5 most indebted states, you're really talking about a very, very elastic resource. Most of the states do not have a tremendous amount of debt per capita. There's a lot of flexibility there. And even then, when you talk about the top states, you know, New York, California, Illinois, Florida, Texas, the big population centers, you know, it's not overwhelming there either. These states are usually very wary of using their general obligation of full faith and credit, and instead usually rely on things called revenue bonds, which, you know, are really backed by revenue from certain projects, or, you know, sometimes it's a sales tax. You know, I mean, MARTA, for example, in Atlanta sold a bond issue, or is going to sell a bond issue this week, and part of that is backed by sales taxes from the city. So we're talking about a very, very flexible source of financing in the municipal bond market as it exists. You know, people like to trump up they put big numbers on the problem and make it a national problem, and then you have the engineers come in with their report, and yeah, I don't know, they might as well have said $1 zillion was needed. You know, as far as I'm concerned, you see this, you know, and sure, you make up the number, okay? And yes, they're a little bit self-interested, I think. So you have to, you know, you have to step away.
Shocking, I guess.
You have to step away from the kind of lunacy that's out there. And, you know, people say, what do you call, I was, you know, just Googling a couple of things before I came down. And I saw a great deal of commentary about the infrastructure cult. I said, oh my heavens, I'm going to appear on a panel speaking about the infrastructure cult. How interesting. I will say that, you know, when you're talking about the infrastructure situation, and people decry the state of American infrastructure, always keep in mind, first of all, the size of the United States. It's not like dealing with, the infrastructure in Germany, right, where you're talking about a very small nation compared to the United States. And you're talking about I don't want to call it a market, let me just say that the state and municipal sector is one that does not reward generalization. It is particular and specific to an insane degree, relying a great deal on local laws and local politics. And sometimes I think that's very important when you think about infrastructure in the United States. It's almost like dealing with infrastructure in 50 separate little countries. And I think I'll just conclude there, and
That's
we can
interesting.
carry
That's
on.
right.
Thanks. Well, we talked a lot about finance, but as people have pointed out, funding, we need funding to back up the financing deals. So I was going to just open it up to anyone who'd like to chime in. What are the congressman brought up raising the gas tax or this VMT tax that's been promoted as an alternative? What are your opinions about what are the most pragmatic or important funding sources going forward?
Okay, because first I want to somehow figure out, is there a deprogramming?
I know. Who's the cult leader?
Cut program for the.
Who's my leader?
You're right. So I think it's actually worth, when we talk about infrastructures, with Joe's comments, the light went off, we think about the bridges falling down, right? I think it's worth drilling down a step or two. We have a water infrastructure serious problem in this country. There are many, many water systems around the country that are out of Clean Water Act compliance, that we have been funding our water systems over the last 40 years by not fixing them, by not maintaining them. We have a transit and a transportation problem. We have a schools problem, just in terms of, when we use the term infrastructure, our heads go to with the highway. But it's not necessarily the biggest problem. And so I think so to answer your question, I think when we go to water, which I think water is, in fact, far more serious. I'm from California as well. It's very serious out there. There's only one source of money for that. There's either general revenue money or there's fees, or there's water fees. And we need to use both. We really need to use both. We need to raise fees adequately, both to adequately fund the system and as potentially a pricing mechanism to help spur conservation. But we also may need to use general funds at a municipal level to equalize the pain, equalize the burden for families that can't afford it. So I think that's really true in pretty much all sectors.
Yeah, that's definitely the way the federal government's been moving with subsidizing the Highway Trust Fund from the,
I will say, when you talk about the federal government, when you talk about Fed funds, every time you might get an infrastructure project, some money for it where it's needed, you have to, of course, buck up for a 5-lane highway out in the cornfield somewhere.
So let me,
It's just the political nature of the beast.
let me jump on that, Joe, because somebody, I think it was Jeff or Mark, mentioned the 200-year Congressman, the 200-year anniversary of the Gallatin Plan. So I worked in the Treasury Department. There are two statues on the two sides of the Treasury Department. One is Alexander Hamilton, right? He's on the money. He was Washington's Treasury Secretary, and the other is Gallatin, who was Jefferson's secretary. Just like kind of Jefferson and Adams were the two faces of the early American tension, so were Gallatin and Hamilton. Hamilton wanted a central bank, a Treasury debt market, a national finance thing. Gallatin was a Jeffersonian. Farms, very wary of central government. One of the few exceptions he made was infrastructure. Why? Because a farm without roads is not a useful concept, or in those days, canals or anything. And in the Gallatin Plan, which was not adopted, he had a great network to maximize value, and he set aside about 5 to 10% for essentially political earmarking in 1808. This has always been part of our national point, and Joe's right that we have 50 different states. But shockingly, even when you got to safety, the bill I worked on, the Bridge to Nowhere bill, the 6,000 earmarks, the height, right? Reagan vetoed a bill for 6 earmarks, and we ended up at 6,000.
It just wasn't enough.
Yeah, well, it was enough to get safety passed. It was enough to get a bill passed.
Right.
And I'm going to say that by the way, what is an earmark? The federal government can allocate money one of 3 ways. We can create a formula. That formula can allocate money either directly to governors who get to pick within their state or maybe lower levels of entities. It would be fantastic. You know, in the transit world, we've done some great things with MPOs in creating regional perspectives. Why? Because when you have 50 little states, as Joe points out, doing 50 different sets of projects, what do they underinvest in? Things that link their state. What's the problem that Christie vetoed? He didn't veto a highway between Trenton and Atlantic City. He vetoed something that went to New York. Not just because did it hurt their benefit, it hurt me. I'm taking the Amtrak, I'm taking the Acela up to the city. I have a meeting in New York tomorrow. I'm suffering because of that lack, right? I pay more in my daily life as a Marylander because Delaware tolls the little sliver of I-95 that they get going into me. When you have 50 states that are interacting like this, you need a little bit of federal lubricant to make the system work because the federal formulas aren't perfect. Allocating money to governors, who knows, you know, where do you think they do with it? They just earmark it at their level, right? Or you can have a federal competitive program where we can debate how inoculated they are from federal politics. And we finally start that allocates money competitively. We historically never had that in highways, had that in transit for new subways. Now we're starting to have a little bit of that with the Tiger program, which I think of as a giant success and a tremendous legacy of the Obama administration, which I proudly worked for. And so the idea that, you know, every dollar has to be spent according to some abstract formula maximization, and by the way, the formulas are likely wrong. And, you know, the formulas, I've helped write them. They're 10 years old on census data. They allocate money to governors who then may earmark within their state. I think we ought to be a little bit, step back and learn about the wisdom of prior generations who solved this problem far better than we are. And not be so reflexively tarnished about one atrocious big bridge project in Alaska that spoiled countless other wise investments that we made in America that simply aren't that interesting to report on.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Just, again, I have to say, I'm really glad that I do not have to deal with the kind of, I deal with politics in California for sure, being a large public plan and being webcast every board meeting. And so we definitely have politics to deal with. But again, I feel like my life is very sort of on the pragmatic level. And so in terms of the question around funding, I just kind of get back to workers' capital. I think as a new, I've been a trustee for 3.5 years and just got reelected for another 4 years. So for me, how I look at the lay of the land in the U.S., I go to these conferences and hang out with trustees all over the country, and I am a little shocked at trustees of public pension funds need to be more engaged. So I'm a big advocate of trustees being more educated, being strong leaders, being good fiduciaries and having their fiduciary hat on first and not other hats that we're tempted to wear in terms of creating value for our funds. But I also think there's a lot of creative, like I said, there's a lot of capital out there with institutional investors. And I think we've been kind of a little old school in our thinking. We've been around, a lot of our funds have been around for a long time. And I know some of our staff get nervous when trustees get engaged and active and get ideas. Yes. Our staff are on their toes at CalSTRS, I will tell you that. But it's good. It's a good thing for a fund. It's a good thing for the staff to be engaged. It's a good thing for trustees to be engaged because we all have the same intent, which is making sure workers' capital is put to work and makes a good return because it's not a good thing for us to be dealing with these unfunded liabilities. But I guess I just go back to, I think there's a lot of creative ways for us to use that capital in a safe, thoughtful way, but in a strategic way. And I think we've been just a little passive. I think we've kind of, sort of said, oh, we don't have the expertise. We need to hire all these fund managers. No offense to any in the audience, but we need to hire the experts. And if there's one thing I've learned as a trustee, there's just a lot of common sense to some of these questions. And I think in a strange way, my background actually has been, I think, a helpful thing on our board because I'm a pragmatist and I'm an active member of our funds. I care a lot about what we do, and I think I have some common sense. And so I think for me, it's trying to capitalize on workers' capital, use it more strategically. And then I think with fees and there's a lot of ways that we can be more, I think, more thoughtful as fiduciaries. And I just don't think we've sort of been leaders. I think we've been more passive. And I think that goes for a lot of things, but I think in the infrastructure space, we need to take more leadership.
That's very interesting. You mentioned the word passive before.
You like that one.
That's very, so much of the time when we're dealing with public-private partnerships, the public officials have behaved in a sort of fashion where they behave as though, here we are, we're presented with this opportunity, and now we have to accept it all the way it's laid out. So when you talk about 75-year contracts, baloney.
Right.
Sit there and say, no, it's going to be a 20-year contract. It's going to be a
That's right.
10-year contract. These were ridiculous, some of these things.
Yeah.
But not because of the nature of public-private partnership, no, because the guys on one end of the table have a lot of knowledge, and the guys on the other end of the table have almost no knowledge and are afraid somehow of getting up to speed. And, when you say that whole business passive, and I don't want to say, Wall Street's encouraged a lot of this, but to leave the driving to us mindset, right?
I'll say it if
it's
you
like,
don't wanna say it,
fine,
I'll
we'll
say it.
just hire somebody and they'll take care of it for
They're
us,
the experts.
please. No, public officials have to get more into the active mindset instead of saying, oh, it's a 75-year contract, what are we going to do? No, sit there and say, no, it's a 20-year contract, and this is how it's going to work, and this is how it's going to work, and this is how it's going to work. Sit down and start negotiating at the table with these guys. I mean, I would sit
That's exactly
right
right.
now and say, okay, New Jersey, talk about public pension plans that are in trouble, okay? An interesting idea posed, I want to say, 10 years ago, was New Jersey asked for an assessment of their various properties to be that could be private, that could be good candidates for privatization. And among those, of course, are the Turnpike Authority and the Garden State Parkway. And I'm kind of shocked that the state hasn't returned to that report that I think they paid UBS or Goldman Sachs for, and taking a look at it and say, we have two very interesting assets here that we could raise a lot of money with, and we could use a lot of that money to patch the hole in our public pensions, which are a drag on our rating and a further drag on how much we have to pay in the market to finance. Same with Illinois. You'd think that Illinois would think about a little further about these privatizations where they can get a good chunk of money now and think about the smartest way to invest it in those public pension plans, which they have been so, another thing they've been lazy about is funding them. If you just, if you put the money in every year, guess what? You're not going to have the big holes.
So I've thought about why folks haven't done that. And there are a few examples of places. Pennsylvania talked about doing it, Indiana. And I think it has to do with the fact that people behave very differently when they're bequeathed an asset and run it down versus when they're bequeathed an asset and they have to sell it because they're broke to make their ends meet. So think about a family where somebody inherits their parents' house. They kind of, they have the joy of living without a mortgage. I'd love to know what that feels like. But the house kind of runs down due to down maintenance, and then they're kind of realize, wow, I could sell this kind of falling down house because now it's the roof rather than patching it, or the furnace rather than fixing it up. Now I need a new one. I could take out a little home equity. I could borrow into the municipal debt to do it, or I could sell my asset and invest that money and live in a small condo, right? That's kind of to some degree what selling the Garden State Parkway is to New Jersey. They got this asset from funding, some amount of funding and financing those little 35-cent tolls. I don't know how much they made up. I hated driving the Garden State before the Easy Pass. And I think that the public reaction to the sale of assets that they feel they got, that their family gave, is very asymmetric than the idea of bringing in private capital for new investment or building something new, one. Two is, I think regarding, Angie, to your point about fees and money, where things are coming from, I'm trying to populate a new term. I'm going to ask for everybody's help in here. Let's get away from the term user fee and think a little bit about beneficiary fee. Users are kind of the classic beneficiaries, but really, I come from a transit background. When you build a subway stop, the beneficiaries are the landowners around the stop, the people that drive the corridor that are still driving, that don't have to handle the train traffic from the other people because I impose a negative externality every time I get in my car of everybody around me. If we could capture more broadly the full beneficiary fees, and I think technology is letting us do this with some land value capture, et cetera, that would be a much broader way. It brings more money in. It's equitable because people are paying based on what they benefit. I think we subconsciously do this already. User fees just target users. It's a subset of beneficiaries. Sales taxes capture beneficiaries who are non-users, but they also capture people who honestly had nothing to do with the system and are simply, walking down and buying a stick of gum. And so there's beneficiary fees broader than user fees, smaller than sales taxes, would be how I'd like to think about it.
Do you have a patent pending on this phrase?
Right.
Beneficiary.
Yeah.
Is there any hope that the federal government would get into land value taxation?
So I could argue that they're already to some degree incentivizing it through things like Tiger. And I think the role of the federal government would be to provide, and I don't want to front run a paper that's coming out in Infrastructure Week that I'm writing for the Hamilton Foundation with Roger Altman and Alan Kruger, but the idea that federal government maybe could juice their share, whether it's on an interest rate subsidy or an investment grant or something like that. And I think we're doing it a little bit subconsciously in Tiger, where people are being more creative about expanding their financing. And maybe you could even argue New Starts does that a little bit, not directly, but in terms of their kind of sub-criteria within their ratings.
And really, land use and property really is a local matter to a certain extent. You could juice it with federal, but what Aaron's talking about can be done locally, quicker, faster, and probably more comprehensively.
Do you notice that at all as this funding situation becomes more tight at the local level, or?
Well, in terms of, he's raised a new concept which I think is really appealing. I think, we see lots of bond measures that pass for specific things. And usually it's an add value, tax on property, or there's a fee on your property tax, or a fee on your utility tax. So people do that at the local level all the time.
Yeah.
Not in that particular way he's described it, but in that concept.
Yeah, no, I'm loath to compliment the state of Virginia, but if you look at what Loudoun County did for the Silver Line, which is the expansion of the metro to Dulles Airport, probably not a good idea, but that's a subject for another day. They actually, as I understood their bond measure value, they put forward a path of property value. We can debate the model, and then they said anything better than that increase is due to the Silver Line if you're within this concentric circle of the stops, and we're going to give you a higher tax rate. So if the money comes through, you win and the government wins. If the money doesn't come through, the higher tax doesn't apply. They back that in the capital markets with an availability fee, so they're on the hook regardless. I think that's kind of, a little bit innovative.
But it's a TIF.
Yes,
it's a
exactly
tax increment,
right.
and people use that all the time.
The federal government has some advantages. I think the Obama administration's kind of one-stop shops that they're starting to open at DOT and transportation to share best practices. I'd love it if they shared worst practices. I think municipalities make the same mistake over and over again.
There you go again. See, in the Treasury Department, I knew it. The Treasury, what they want to do is do away with the tax exemption on the municipal debt. And they say if we could just somehow put all together under the federal government's aegis, then we'll be fine. No, be very careful about this kind of thing. They've been trying this since the tax exemption was put on bonds in 1913, and the Treasury has been fighting ever since then to get it removed. So keep this in mind, because the tax-exempt finance provides states and localities with that very flexible, low-cost means of financing their own projects.
So Joe, I thought you were going to be the anti-hysteric on the panel.
Only on this subject, a tax exemption, I knew it.
Silencing hysteria.
The Treasury Department during my time was trying to do no such thing. I will point out 3 things that we were trying to do, some of which we were successful and some of which we weren't. The tax exemption on municipal debt is an inefficient subsidy mechanism. It is-
Camel gets its nose under the
Here we
tent.
go.
See, I knew it.
You're gonna have
Tell
to
me
start
I
wearing
was
your
wrong.
referee shirt now.
Right.
You drew
Right.
blood, Joe.
Just because, look, I'll tell you, I love the idea of taking, of passing big comprehensive measures, even if that includes a little bit of the federal government picking projects, which is a little inefficient. I acknowledge that. Inefficiency doesn't always mean wrong, but you got to acknowledge fact. When you set a bond price, just like, when you set ticket sales for a stadium venue, you have kind of flat seating regardless of, how people are willing to pay, and the secondary market gets that. In the Ticketmaster scalper example, we call that in economics consumer surplus, and that gets arbitraged away. In the municipal debt market, what happens is, because a lot of it's heavily retail, is that the top marginal tax rate doesn't have enough demand, and it tends to clear at the second marginal tax rate. The second marginal tax rate means that the federal government is providing, the municipalities are getting, econometric studies will average between 25 and 32%. I'm going to pick 28. Reasonable minds could give plus or minus. You get a 28% subsidy for the value at the time of issuance for the public sector. However, if you're in that top bracket, at the time of issuance, you get a 35%, or then if you're a bondholder and the top marginal tax rate gets raised, as President Obama did when the Bush tax cuts are sunset, you get a windfall. Now your federal investment has gone from 35% to 39%. 4% may not sound like a lot to you, but if you're in debt markets, it sounds like a tremendous windfall. What the administration has done to try and solve that is threefold. One is the Build America Bond Program, which gave municipalities the ability to issue taxable debt. That actually solved both the problem I'm describing and the problem that Sharon has, which is her fund can't buy municipal debt. It would be against her fiduciary duty. So by relying exclusively on tax-free municipal debt, you're kicking out private capital, worker capital, in a discriminatory fashion. 2 is by proposing a 28% tax exemption, you're getting rid of that inefficiency in the system, so everybody's getting the same value throughout it. That's a proposal. The Build America bonds, no state or locality had to issue a single one. In 18 months, $180 billion were issued. They ended up being a quarter of the market. Purely
And what have you
voluntary
done with
program.
those subsidies? The subsidies that we're supposed to pay for Build America bonds have declined every year, have they not?
No.
Yes?
The subsidies, the federal government subsidy to the
It's
locality,
reducing the subsidies.
right, they were given a 35% rate, fixed in perpetuity for the issuance. It was higher than the revenue marginal rate. It cost the federal government money. It was part of the Economic Stimulus, or ARA, Recovery Act, because we wanted to juice. We wanted to provide a little more than revenue neutral. During the sequester, there was one time period where that got haircut, the little payment to the states and localities, which is a disaster of implementation. I can tell you when we passed Build America bonds, we never dreamed of a world of sequester, which I think was a major mistake, by the way, to even allow them to be sequesterable, a mistake in drafting. But they're fixed in statute at 35%.
I hate to get in the middle of this, but we want to leave some time for questions. So if anyone out there has a question, just have your hand up, and we have mics going around. Looks like there's one in the back.
I want to connect something that Aaron said and also Sharon did, in thinking about how funding and financing happens now on a state-by-state or locality measure, or how to do regional decision-making. And I'm thinking about how you can also find more deals, Sharon, right? Because that's a problem for our pension funds when we're looking at, we've made an allocation, where do we find it? And is there somewhere in between those two where a pension fund could play a good role? Because really no one's looking out for a set of states, if you look at the Northeast Corridor and high-speed rail, who's thinking about the region? And I don't know if the West Coast Infrastructure Exchange is a way to sort of do that, but it
Yeah.
just seems to me like a very particularly important role the pension funds could play is to sort of think about a region, or maybe a group of funds coming together to look at a region. And does that sort of get us out of the municipal, state, federal funding that we have right now?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. And I know Vonda works with SEIU and does a lot of work with trustee development around this country, so I appreciate your work, Vonda. Yeah, I mean, I just was up in BC. I think we have a BC guy in the audience speaking to trustees up there. And I was approached afterwards. A lot of folks were really interested in having a dialogue. We have, if you're not familiar, we have a West Coast infrastructure, kind of a network of really smart people who are thinking about infrastructure on the West Coast. So our friends in Oregon, Washington, and obviously in California. And so the BC folks were really interested in having conversations around that. I think that there's an alignment of interest for sure for us on the West Coast with infrastructure. I think that the challenge is we come to a lot of these things and we talk about it and we have lots of great conversations and it's really interesting to think about. I know for me, I want to make some deals. I want to invest workers' capital in a tangible way. So I think the challenge is getting it done, I guess, is my bottom line. So I'm really excited. I think for me, one of the benefits of coming to things like this is meeting some folks, and just, you kind of meet people and go, oh, I think we could, we could get something done. So I think that there's a lot of potential, I think, with the West Coast infrastructure. There's a lot of folks passionate about infrastructure on the West Coast. So I really like I like that idea. I think one of the things I'm a little, I shouldn't say, one of the things I'd like to see CalSTRS do more is investing on the West Coast. Quite frankly, the deals we're finding are over in Europe, and Australia and other places. And so, and our stakeholders come and say, invest in California, and I would love to invest in California. It's my home. I love California. But I'm a fiduciary of the system, and my number one mandate is to increase maximize our returns. So I think that's always in the bottom line for me. But I'm really excited about some of the relationships we're developing on the West Coast, and I'd love to see us. I'd love to see the kind of partnerships we're having with this fund that we're doing infrastructure. It's not a U.S. fund, so I think that's interesting. I'd like to do more relationships with U.S. funds on infrastructure investing, and on the West Coast, I'd be really excited about that.
So, Vonda, I think you raised the critical issue, which is that we have a country that works great in terms of funding things at a state-by-state level, used to work great in doing things at a national level, and struggles at that regional level in between. And in reality, where we struggle is not, because I think Joe started with a great point, which is we have a really good infrastructure system in America. It's not as top-notch as it should be. It's not as top-notch as it once was relative to other places in the world, but it's pretty good. And the areas where we're better is within the state. There's a planning element that's useful. I think England does a much wiser job in picking corridors and doing an analysis based on a corridor first, and then asking what's the right infrastructure mode of solution. Is it a new airport extension? Is it a freight rail upgrade? Is it a new highway lane? Is it a high-speed rail? And instead, we kind of do the opposite. We think about how do we want to invest in which mode of transportation, and then think a little bit about, how do we patch the states together. If I was going to put on a big picture, it would be fantastic if every part of America kind of thought about the region or corridor that was most important to them, whether it's Wichita to Kansas City or the Northeast corridor or LA to San Francisco,
Right.
and then we put one giant package together. I'm sure there'd be a little bit of inefficiency in some of the rural exchange, maybe, but maybe not. Maybe there'd be inefficiency in some of the urban exchanges. I don't know. But if we could think about it, maybe going big could be a better solution from a Washington perspective than going small.
It looks like we have another question in the back.
I love that.
I'm Larry Blaine from British Columbia. Don, if I can paraphrase your view, I think your view is that one should not do a public-private partnership unless it's the last possible way of financing a project. And I've heard that view before in the United States. I've heard it in Canada. I've heard it in many countries. And I know intuitively you'd think that if the cost of capital is higher, that the project is going to cost more. But there's over 100 countries in the world doing public-private partnerships, and the overwhelming belief, rightly or wrongly, is that the benefits of doing public-private partnerships offset those higher financing costs. Government is a proven failure at delivering major projects, and the private sector does bring some efficiencies. They certainly will take risk, and we can design contracts that are performance-based that manage the asset for the life of the asset and prevent deferred maintenance and all of the extra costs that those imply. So I disagree with your supposition, and maybe the United States is different. I'm not an expert, but I just know that in other countries they strongly believe that there are offsetting benefits.
Okay, so let me respond to a couple of points there. So one is, I think your assumption about my position is one notch more radical than it is. I think there may be other circumstances where you use P3s. I'm not as hardline as what I came out to. I was given a question to answer. This is my role. It's what it happens all the time. The second thing is, the second point is, we don't build anything publicly. So all infrastructure is done with design build at least, right? And so lots of projects, innovatively done, many on time and under budget, both whether they're a P3 or they're not a P3. I can't remember the specific projects in LA where we did some recently. So there's, in terms of putting things in the ground, that's always done the same way, right? And so then the last point is, we've started to look at, and you'll have more experience at this and love to talk to you about it. I've read some of the papers from DC about value for money analysis. We've started to look, it's a little bit in the weeds, at some of the ones done in the US, and they seem highly, highly speculative, the value for money analysis. And so we want to drill down to find a value for money analysis that takes away some of the speculation, makes it a little more real, and makes sure it includes things that the full set of things we value. It's a little bit code. Maybe we can talk later about it. There was one other point that I can't remember. Oh, and then risk. I think the issue of risk is important as well, because we are shifting, the P3s, I understand, are shifting from revenue-based P3s to P3s based on availability payments. And that's a rolling back, that's a sharing of risk, not a shifting of risk. And so it's just issues to talk through.
I think we have time for one more.
Can I make a quick comment while we're waiting for the last
Yeah.
question, if there's another question?
Go ahead.
One of the comments I would just make, in my world, what I've learned is, when we have these conversations, it's easy to hedge funds is a perfect example. CalPERS got out of hedge funds, so at CalSTRS and other funds, everyone's like, what do you think about hedge funds? I think, it's easy to sort of talk about these different asset classes as just these entities. And I really look at hedge funds as a strategy, and I think there's lots of different strategies and approaches to investing, and they're not necessarily bad or good. So I guess, when we talk about the PPPs or different models, I think at the end of the day, what really matters is that there needs to be, I think it's clear there needs to be some new ideas and new ways of thinking. And then I think, I'll just put my trustee hat on again. Trustees and the staff of, funds making the deals need to have some control over language in these deals. I think that's the bottom line. I don't think there's sort of some panacea out there or a perfect program. I love going to conferences, and there's always the newest, latest, flavor of the month kind of stuff, smart beta, things that people talk about. And I think those are interesting, and I'm happy to talk about them. But I just think at the end of the day, investors and folks who have capital need to have more control over the language, so that we're getting the best bang for our buck. So I guess I just like to pull away from the nomenclature sometimes, because I think it tends to polarize us a bit.
I think Jeff up here. Oh, is there?
As somebody who comes from New York, I'd just like to ask this final question of all of you. Do you all really believe that infrastructure is pretty good around America? Several of you have said something like that or nodded your head in agreement. It's hard as a New Yorker for me to believe that.
Well, don't take it's easy, one of the angriest people I know is someone who takes the IRT #1 subway line every day from the Upper West Side to, the Wall Street area. I take the F train. I'm not from
mellow
Brooklyn
dude.
to New York. But, it's easy to take the New York-centric point of view and say like, well, oh, look at this. All airports are like LaGuardia. Right? And it's not true. You go to, that's why some people move away. And, my life is so much easier. I can just drive to the train station or drive to the airport. And the airport is fine. It's not insane. So, you have to get away from that sort of urban mindset and think the big picture.
There are many times around the country for airport where it's pretty bad. It's not just
Don't
So-
generalize.
That may have been my comment to originate. When I was at Treasury, I led a delegation to India to talk about infrastructure financing there. So we light years ahead, right? So pretty good is a relative question as to where are you going to go, right? Or, how are we facing against Europe? How are we facing against China? How are we facing against Japan? Against our global competitors? We're falling behind. We're falling behind from where we were, and it will have profound economic consequences for us in the future. If you look at giant, long decades of expansion, they tend to be the decade after a giant infrastructure investment, whether that was the interstate system in the 50s and the boom of the 60s, the electrification of the teens and the booms of the 20s, go all the way back. I think you started with the canal, and you made the seminal point that New York didn't wait for America to act. Baltimore waited for America to act. We were going to be part of the national road and the national canal. And in 1810, there are a lot of reasons to be more bullish on Baltimore being America's hub for economic activity than New York. We were more centrally located. We had a better deep water port naturally, et cetera, and so forth. You built the canal. We didn't. I'm going to New York tonight. How many of you are going to Baltimore to do your business? Right? That being said, we're in a system of decay. We're beginning to wake up to how quickly we're decaying, but our start of decay, where we were when we began to go down, was basically in the top 5 globally of infrastructure. So maybe that adds a little more nuance.
So Joe doesn't want us to generalize. So I'm just going to talk about Los Angeles. I live in Eagle Rock, which is kind of near Occidental College. I walk on sidewalks that you trip all. I have a lovely old retired woman, Armenian woman next to me who's tripping on the sidewalks all the time. LA, we have a lot of issues that that are challenges in terms of, just daily life. And I think a lot of times, we in this room have the privilege to have options to use things that make life more comfortable. We have I have a lot of students who don't have those options. And so I think infrastructure impacts us in different ways. But I think in Los Angeles, I really do see some challenges. And I worry, UCLA, there was this huge we've had 2 major water main breaks in the last year. And obviously in California, we worry about earthquakes. So you have things like bridges. And so, I am concerned about infrastructure.
And I think you do have to operate at both levels. You have to talk about it at the macro level, like Aaron did, because there are some things that are really, sort of nationally threatening, right? Water systems, transportation systems, things that could affect the national economy in profound ways. But there are also, like in LA, turns out we live pretty close to each other. The streets and sidewalk. A close friend of mine is the infrastructure director for the mayor. Their biggest problem is streets and sidewalks. And the problem with sidewalks is 40 years ago, someone decided to plant ficus trees to create shade. And if you have a house with a ficus tree, your sidewalk is destroyed. So, and they're trying to figure out that, and in our water systems, all that. LAX, I'm in virtually every week. I go home as angry as the guy on the IRT every day. It's the worst airport in the world. And so you got to operate at both levels, because at the practical level is in fact where you will engage people. It's where decision makers and real people are engaged. They're the problems people are trying to solve right now. And that's what adds up to the general.